Welcome to Guelph Museum's Military Lecture Speaker Series. My name is Ken Irvin, and I'd like to thank the Laurier Centre for the History of Canada for being a partner in our lecture series. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that Guelph is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe peoples, specifically the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Through the Between the Lakes Purchase No. 3 Treaty of 1792, the Mississaugas of the Credit ceded to the British Crown over 3 million acres of land, which were between Lakes Huron, Ontario, and Erie. Today, Guelph is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Guelph Museums continues to build our knowledge and relationships about the land, its history, and its peoples, and this commitment informs all that we do at Guelph Museums. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. Emily Oakes is a Ph.D. student in the Department of History at Wilfrid Laurier University. Her research focuses on the historical relationships between humans and horses in Canadian society. She's also interested in Canadian military history, having written her MA, major research paper on soldier-horse relationship in the First World War. Emily is the archives manager at the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada, and we're very pleased to have her speak on her thesis topic. So thanks so much for coming with us tonight, Emily.
My name is Emily Oakes. I just wanted to take a second here to thank Ken, Serena, and everyone else at the Guelph Civic Museum for the opportunity to speak here. I used to volunteer here and at the McCrae House in high school, and I'm very happy to be back at such a great museum. Getting into my presentation, the title comes from the words of J.E.B. Seeley. He was the commander of the Canadian Cavalry Brigade for much of the First World War. In 1934, he published a book entitled My Horse Warrior, which was essentially the story of his and warriors' experiences throughout the First World War. And his book was his way of commemorating his horse and his relationship with this horse. Seeley's role as the commander of the Canadian Cavalry Brigade meant that Warrior would have been much more prominent than the average working equine on the Western Front. This image has a slide. Oh, here we go. Hold on. There we go. So on this slide is an image by the renowned British equine painter, Sir Alfred Munnings, of Seeley and his horse Warrior. And this is part of the Canadian War Memorials Fund collection. Munnings actually also illustrated Seeley's book. So throughout that book, Seeley repeatedly explained that he could not have survived the war or been a successful general without Warrior. He wrote, "In the late war, nearly all Warrior's comrades were killed, and nearly all of mine. But we both survived, and largely because of him." For Seeley, their wartime survival then was dependent upon Warrior and the close relationship they had. In another example, Captain Stanley Harrison, in a poem entitled Requiem, dated November 1st, 1917, and written in Flanders, wrote about his warhorse's death. "And now we part, brave loyal heart. No more shall saddle fret thee. While life reflects the sights and sounds we loved, I will never forget thee." Harrison's words emphasize the connection and love he had for his mare. His poem echoes the sentiments of many First World War Canadian soldiers and highlights the deep bond that can form between human and horse in the context of war. The relationships between Seeley and Warrior, or Harrison and his unnamed mare, are two examples of the thousands of connections formed between Canadian soldiers and their equine comrades over the course of the First World War. Horses were essential to the ability of the major combatants to wage the war through their roles as transportation and in artillery and cavalry. The intimate proximity between humans and horses in warfare provided opportunities for interspecies relationships to be developed. For some, such as Jackson Ludlow Weeks, who believed the horses he was paired with at Whitley Training Camp in England did not show any intelligence whatsoever, those partnerships could be very frustrating. For many others, it was a positive experience, likened to a friendship that aided them in their wartime survival on the Western Front. For example, transport driver James Robert Johnston wrote, "If it seems sometimes that my emotions are overruling my sounder judgment, it only shows in a small way how a man and horse can become attached to one another under rugged circumstances. A fellow soon becomes attached to his saddle horse, and the feeling is very mutual. Like Seeley and Harrison, Johnston formulated a bond with his saddle horse Splittier during the months that Splittier was assigned to him. In this presentation, I will argue that within the context of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces in the First World War, the soldier-horse relationship functioned as a useful mutual survival mechanism to refer to the various ways that, here I apologize. Here I use the term mutual survival mechanism to refer to the various ways that soldiers and equines helped each other to survive. The first section of my presentation will examine the practical factors that contributed to the relationships that formed between soldiers and their horses or mules, as well as how those bonds help both participants survive the environment to the Western Front. The second section will consider multiple aspects of how the soldier-horse relationship contributed to the psychological survival of the soldiers who interacted with them. In this presentation, I will use Jane Flynn's definition of the term soldier-horse relationship. She defines it as the mutual understanding necessary for horse and human to work in partnership, and more specifically, to function effectively together in a military context. Although horses and mules working along the Western Front were silent, many of the soldiers who worked with them were not. As a result, I was able to consult letters, diary entries, and trench newspapers to understand soldiers' perspectives on horses as they were experiencing the First World War. Memoirs, such as the ones written by James Robert Johnston or J.E.B. Seeley, were also used to understand soldiers' thoughts about their horses and mules. Those sources revealed the thoughts of individual soldiers who were deeply invested in a bond with their war horses. To give a little context, at the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914, there were 25,000 horses in service with the British Expeditionary Forces, compared to about 80 motor vehicles. By 1917, the number of horses in military service had risen to over 1 million. The sheer scale of those numbers highlighted the value of equines to the British war effort, of which the Canadians played an essential part. A total of nearly 72,000 equines, so both horses and mules, were used by the Canadian Expeditionary Forces during the First World War. The British, and by extension Canadian armies, typically purchased horses that stood between 14.3 and 16.1 hands tall, and they preferred mares first, followed by geldings. Remounts, purchased in Canada and the USA, came in many varieties, such as heavy and light drafts, cavalry and officers' chargers, troopers, cobs, and mules. In this slide, you can see the physical differences in the kinds of horses used. On the left is John McCrae and his officer's mount Bonfire, who is a typical example of the kind of horse used for riding purposes in the First World War. On the right is a far heavier draft type horse, who would have been used predominantly for hauling and transportation. Transport animals worked even harder than normal when a unit was stationed at the front lines, since they had to haul supplies. They are often under shell fire. Artillery units extensively relied on teams of horses to haul the guns and ammunition. Those teams of horses that moved artillery pieces would typically consist of 6 to 8 in number. Further, they needed pack horses and mules to carry the shells to those guns. In addition to working as transport and hauling artillery, cavalry was used where environmental circumstances allowed to provide reconnaissance, troop mobility, and a shock factor on the battlefield. Within the Canadian context, the Canadian Cavalry Brigade was the most prominent concentration of mounted soldiers. That unit spent much of the conflict as an integral part of the British Cavalry Corps, where they typically supported British military actions. The Canadian Expeditionary Forces also made use of the Canadian Light Horse to support divisions of Canadian infantry. According to Seeley, cavalry were used as mobile riflemen who fought dismounted. They were used for reconnaissance duties or rarely in cavalry charges. The main value of First World War cavalry, no matter which of the duties it performed, was its superior mobility. It was impossible to use cavalry to break through Western Front entrenchments. Nevertheless, where terrain allowed for mobility, Particularly in 1918, Canadian cavalry carried out reconnaissance, pursuit, and delay operations that were tactically successful. In the image on this slide, you can see the Fort Garry horse on the move near Cambrai in 1918. Additionally, as evidenced through the primary sources, another part of the equine participation in the First World War was the treatment of horses and mules by the Canadian Army Veterinary Corps. So throughout the war then, horses and mules filled a variety of essential roles, most often in transport, as they worked with soldiers to support the war effort. As horses and mules worked alongside soldiers, connections formed and grew. The military use of horses and the relationships that developed between horses and men in the First World War were shaped by the recent experience of the Boer War from 1899 to 1902. Similar to its issues mobilizing human combatants in the Boer War, the British Army had serious problems deploying and maintaining its equines. In the Boer War, the soldier-horse relationship did not function effectively as a mutual survival device due to extremely high equine wastage rates. From the beginning, horses imported via sea routes were rushed to the battlefields with not sufficient time to acclimatize to the foreign environment, weakening them before they were even expected to withstand the rigors of an active campaign. One of the biggest factors that contributed to equine wastage in the conflict was the lack of training that the British Army gave to soldiers working with horses in basic equine care. Although many men who became soldiers had worked alongside horses in the civilian life, many others had not, as a result of increasing mechanization in Britain and its empire. In addition, at that time in the British Army, its remount depots and equine hospitals were combined facilities. That organizational structure significantly contributed to the spread of diseases such as glanders and episodic zoonotic lymphangitis, as well as parasites such as mange, and by extension, the death rate of horses and mules, as sick and healthy animals were not separated. Another factor that caused high equine wastage rates in the Boer War was exhaustion. It was the main cause of equine death. In that conflict, not nearly so many horses would have died of exhaustion if soldiers had been properly instructed in horse care and could recognize, prevent, and treat the symptoms. The acute and incessant demand for new remounts resulting from these high wastage rates caused another vital complication to the soldier-horse relationship. Since horses broke down so often, particularly of disease and exhaustion, they could not be relied upon by their soldiers to do their expected work. That issue was intensified, particularly in situations when the pair were under fire. Conversely, many of the horses could not rely upon their soldiers to properly feed, water, or care for them. From that weak base, high wastage rates meant that any relationships that were building between soldiers and horse were destroyed with the death of the animal. As a result, the frequent equine deaths in the Boer War were a major obstacle to the soldier-horse relationship for the way that they negatively affected soldiers' morale. Further, it negated the responsibility that a soldier felt for his horse, since he lacked the time to build a relationship with it, and consequently might not care for it as well as if he had built a bond. In the drawing on this slide, you can see a starving and exhausted horse drawn by E.W.B. Morrison, who served in the Boer War. So the Boer War then left a legacy that impacted British and, by extension, Canadian war horses. As a result of the equine carnage of the Boer War, multiple changes were made to reduce military equine wastage. For example, the 429,000 horses and 275,000 mules shipped from North America to support the British war effort between 1914 and 1918 were sent first to remount depots in Britain. There, the equines were given significantly more time to recover from their sea voyage and adjust to the environment than they had in the Boer War. Once recovered and trained to military standards, they were shipped to the Western Front. In addition to increased time allowance for acclimatization, changes were made to emphasize bonding between soldier and horse in hopes it would result in superior care of the animal, and by extension, more efficacy and longevity of war horses. Before 1903, the Army was more concerned with teaching soldiers to ride rather than to efficiently care for their horses. After 1904, however, soldiers were always to use the same horse which they were to care for, a measure that would support the development of a connection between that soldier and his horse. That pragmatically improved the working lifespan of Army equines. Because they were at the center of the units that utilized them, horses and mules' condition and well-being shaped daily work patterns. Each soldier interacted with his horse or horses as individuals, and as a result, even if he did not have a close emotional attachment to his horse, each soldier would have had a functional working relationship with that animal. Another shift that occurred as a result of the British Army's experiences in the Boer War was increased focus on daily care for horses, which became prevalent leading into the First World War. That increased emphasis on horse care was especially evident in field manuals. While those were all pragmatic instructions specifically designed to ensure the efficiency and utility of the horses through proper care, they nevertheless also functioned to promote the soldier-horse relationship in multiple ways. First, those updated manuals and practices stressed that the horse or mule was the responsibility of the individual soldier. That would have instilled in many soldiers a feeling of ownership and pride in their equine charges, therefore improving their care. Additionally, the improved care given to the horse would have kept it in better physical condition, thus assisting the development of a bond between soldier and horse, simply by improving the horse's chance of survival. As a result of the Boer War, changes were also made to the existing structure for veterinary medicine in the British Army. In 1913, the Army Veterinary Corps was separated from the remount department. That meant that the Army Veterinary Corps now had its own logistics and authority, which made it far more efficient, and it separated remounts from sick and injured animals. Furthermore, with the Canadian Army Veterinary Corps, their important work kept horses and mules alive and in enough health that they could form and preserve enduring bonds with the soldiers who cared for them. The efforts of the Canadian Army Veterinary Corps personnel to increase the health and longevity of war equines had a significant impact on the performance of Canadian units on the Western Front. Without enough healthy horses and mules, communication and supply lines in particular would have broken down and negatively affected the ability of units to perform their assigned tasks. Over the course of the war, 41,365 horses and mules were cured of their sickness or wounds, or were evacuated for more treatments by the Canadian Army Veterinary Corps. Only 5,303 horses and mules, which were assessed by Canadian veterinary officers, died or were euthanized. In the slides on this screen, you can see soldiers treating a mule for a skin condition, which was most likely mange on the left. And on the right, you can see a horse being treated for shrapnel wounds. A major challenge to the soldier-horse relationship in the Canadian Expeditionary Forces was the environment of the Western Front. One aspect that was repeatedly emphasized in the primary sources was the hardships brought on by mud, especially in the colder months. Further, the environment of the Western Front was exceedingly dangerous to both soldier and horse. When one partner was killed, a new bond would have to be built with the soldier or horse who replaced the one that had died. When hazards, such as nails in the ground, injured the horse, for example, and it was taken out of frontline service, the soldier would have to form a new relationship, with its replacement. That new bond would start out weaker than the one it replaced, and thus not nearly as effective in promoting survival. Because the environment was such an obstacle to survival on the Western Front, however, it encouraged the development of a relationship in the partnerships that remained intact. Almost every source that I looked at emphasized those hardships I mentioned that were brought on by mud. a poem published in the trench newspaper, the O-Pip, from the 58th Battery of the Canadian Field Artillery, was simply entitled Mud and depicted those frustrations connected to the environment. Mud was prevalent, especially in the winter. Seely's cavalry charger Warrior was nearly killed, for example, by sinking into the mud near Passchendaele. He was rescued by Seely and 3 other soldiers who managed to get him out of the mud. Seely also highlighted that winters in particular were cruel to horses no less than men. The roads were so completely broken up by alternate frost, snow, and rain that the only way to get ammunition to the forward batteries was to carry it up in panniers slung on horses. Often these poor beasts, who were led forward in long strings with 3 shells on each side of them, would sink deep in the mud. Sometimes, in spite of all their struggles, they could not extricate themselves and died where they fell. In 1915, Sir Andrew McPhail vividly emphasized the difficulties brought on by the mud, especially for horses, when he explained in his diary that the country is a sea of mud. It covers shell holes on the roads. A man may ride into these holes and lose his horse, himself only escaping if he swims. A horse in many places leaves a swale in the mud as another does in the snow. As a transport officer, McPhail would have been particularly attuned to the conditions of the roads. D.S. Tamblin explained with a distressing visual that in muddy conditions, the horses would die on their feet and be propped up by the mud. Despite care from soldiers, some horses died as a direct result of the mud and exposure. However, for the remainder that did survive, the increased care given to them by soldiers to mitigate the worst effects of the weather highlighted the importance of the soldier-horse relationship to equine survival on the Western Front. The image on the left highlights the muddy conditions that horses endured, in this case as they transported ammunition. In the photograph on the right, horses and mules are being watery in wintry conditions. You can see the horses on the left mainly, and on the right are a few mules, which you can tell by the differences in their body shape and their far larger ears. Beyond the difficulty of surviving the mud and weather, particularly in winter, the hazards of the Western Front terrain for both humans and equines were highlighted in multiple sources. That idea, for example, was showcased in the personnel record of Harry Harpin, a soldier from Elora, Ontario. Harpin served as a driver with the 16th Battery of the Canadian Field Artillery. According to his personnel record, Harpin came to death when watering his horses in a pond near Avali. The horse he was riding lost its footing in a shell hole in the bed of the pond, throwing him into the water. He was caught in barbed wire and grass entanglements in the bed of the pond, and he drowned before help could reach him. Thus, even in a relatively safe situation behind the lines, the landscape of the Western Front could be deadly. A major danger for horses were the nails and metal that littered the Western Front. If a horse stepped on a nail and punctured its hoof, it would likely become lame and unable to perform its expected work. In an effort to reduce punctures in horse hooves, different divisions tacked up posters, and they also placed boxes along roads which nails could be deposited into. Further, they sent soldiers out to search the ground and collect nails and other sharp objects that could injure the animals. In addition to these hazards, the constant gun and shell fire was obviously a danger. Sidney Winterbottom, for example, in a letter to his parents explained that there was 4 dead horses on the roadside, a transport wagon was overturned in a ditch, and a railway engine over a bank. The funny thing about it was it all looked so natural to see these things, and no one was the least surprised. Maurice Cullen's painting on the screen here depicts that dangerous reality of the Western Front. This terrifying environment killed thousands of horses, mules, and soldiers. Nevertheless, as I discussed earlier, the Canadian Army Veterinary Corps saved and returned thousands of animals to work at the front lines. While it challenged the soldier-horse relationship, as it often caused the death of one or both participants, the environment of the Western Front could also help strengthen that bond. Especially in muddy and cold conditions, men had to work harder to feed, water, shelter, and groom their equine charges, which meant that both horse and human spent more time together. Routine care of horses mitigated some of the difficulties of the Western Front environment. Daily care practices, such as grooming, were implemented as a practical measure to prolong the life and utility of horses and mules, which were expensive military property. The time spent together as a result of daily care and expected work formed a basis for a bond that was strong enough that in certain cases, it even saved the lives of horses or soldiers. Grooming in particular had a positive impact on the soldier-horse relationship. First, it acted as a practical solution to removing mud, preventing skin conditions, and checking for injuries. Grooming, and the way it encouraged a tight bond with a human, would have relieved a horse of some of the anxiety and stresses of the wartime environments. Seeley's portrayal of Laurier in certain parts of his book highlights that idea. Their relationship was strong enough that from the beginning of the war through to the end, Laurier would go wherever Seeley asked under shell fire. Seeley explained that, "I rode Laurier in shell fire, sometimes so heavy that he was almost the only survivor. But never once did he attempt to bolt or do any of the things which might be expected of an animal reputed to be so naturally timid as the horse." Johnston, too, noted instances where his horse, in particular Split Ear, chose to stay with him rather than shying or bolting when under heavy shell fire. That was a particularly useful behavior for Johnston, a horse transport driver, since his work was often done under shell fire, and a horse that chose to remain with him rather than bolting would have gotten supplies moved much more efficiently. The behavior of those horses indicated that they seemed to find comfort in the presence of their soldiers amidst the chaos of the Western Front. In the photographs on this side, you can see horses being watered on the left and an example of the horse lines on the right. Daily care rituals, such as grooming, emphasize the positive effects of the soldier-horse relationship for the soldier's morale. For example, in his introduction to Tamblin's 1920 book, Sir Arthur Currie wrote, "No one who has ever had to do with horses and with soldiers can fail to acknowledge how much the horse helped to keep up the morale of the man. The very work of tending a horse was a distraction which relieved the trooper or gunner from the otherwise unrelenting tension of warfare. The few minutes of pleasant companionship made him more ready for the battle of a new day." For Currie, then, horses were essential to keeping up morale for the men that interacted with them, as well as calming and distracting soldiers from the dangerous work they had to do at the front. Spending time with Laurier was a great stress relief for Seeley, as evidenced throughout his memoir. For example, when they were stationed behind the lines near an aerodrome, he and Laurier would race the taking off planes, as the nearby soldiers placed bets on who would win. Those races were enjoyable for both Laurier and Seeley, as well as the men betting on the outcomes. John McCrae's morale, too, benefited from his relationship with his own mount, Bonfire. John McCrae often mentioned Bonfire in the letters that he wrote home. In a letter from December 1915, for example, McCrae explained to his mother, "I wish you can meet Bonfire. His is one of the dearest things in horses that one could find. Somebody said lately why he knows you. He has a way of resting his chin on my shoulder that makes me think he does." McCrae also recounted the amusing way that Bonfire would kiss the nursing sisters, as well as his grooms in that letter. For McCrae, his relationship with Bonfire seemed to lift his spirits, and by extension, has a positive effect for him. His letters also implied that Bonfire, through his antics such as kissing the nursing sisters and grooms, could improve the morale of others who interacted with that horse. In the photographs on these slides, you can see on the left a nurse, soldier, and horse. The side saddle on the horse indicates that the nurse was the one that was riding. I have not yet come across any written sources that describe Canadian nurses riding horses in the First World War. but this picture does indicate that it did happen. In the photograph on the right, you can see the foal named Vimy and its mother. Vimy was born on Vimy Ridge in 1917. The physical condition of both horses, as well as the foal's survival in the first place, attest to the care given by the soldiers in the 20th Battery of the Canadian Field Artillery. Further, the fact that the foal, being too young and small to work, was kept around implies that it was loved by and cared for by the soldiers. In instances where the soldier-horse relationship became very strong, both horse and human on occasion saved each other's lives. Many of the authors, particularly in the memoirs, recounted examples of that phenomenon. In My Horse Warrior, Seeley noted multiple instances of this. At one point, he rescued Warrior from a burning barn. In another instance, Warrior was nearly completely buried by the earth churned up by a shell. Only one front hoof was uncovered. Seeley and some nearby soldiers managed to dig Warrior out unharmed. According to Seeley, Warrior too saved his life on occasion. For example, Seeley credited both their survival and their successful cavalry charge at Morale Wood in March 1918 to Warrior's steady behavior under fire. In the image on this slide, you can see a painting by Munnings, which depicts a different part of the Canadian Cavalry Brigade's actions in Morale Wood. This is Flaherty's squadron charging German machine guns. Beyond his own relationship with Warrior, Seeley wrote that one of the finest things about that indomitable creature, the English soldier of the front line, was his invariable kindness, and indeed his gentleness, at all times to the horses. I hardly ever saw a man strike a horse in anger during all the 4 years of the war. And again I have seen a man risk his life, and indeed lose it, for the sake of his horse. While Seeley's relationship with Warrior was unique, his inclusion of the idea that other soldiers risked their lives for their equines as well indicated that the bond between soldier and horse could assist in their survival. In his book, Tamblyn echoed that idea, that men would risk their lives for their equine partners. While this did not always guarantee the survival of the soldiers and horses, it did showcase the depth of the relationship that could build between the two. Thus, the strength of the soldier-horse relationship, in certain cases, was solid enough to compel either soldiers or horses to save the life of their partner in dangerous situations. There were a variety of psychological and emotional factors that contributed to the positive effects of the soldier-horse relationship. Naming practices, for example, contributed to the development of relationships between soldiers and their horses and mules. Soldiers within the British Army were encouraged by both welfare organizations as well as the military itself to name their equines, as both groups believed naming animals contributed to the strengthening of interspecies bonding. Tamblyn's personal horse, for example, was named Snookums, which seems to be a term of endearment, as you can see him in the photograph on the left from Tamblyn's book. While Seeley did not explain the origin of Warrior's name, it served the horse well throughout the Great War. According to Warrior's obituary, published in the Evening Standard in 1941, Canadian horse soldiers called Warrior the horse that the Germans could not kill. In his memoir, James Robert Johnston described his team as follows. My team was named Split Ear and Tuppence. One had a large split ear, and the other one, well, an Englishman took him up the line one night with ammunition, and when he got back, someone asked him what he thought of the horse, and he said, the damn thing was not worth a 2 pence, so the name. When Johnston got the mumps in March 1918, he was invalidated out of the front lines. When he returned to frontline service, he was upset with the unnamed horses that he had, since he had had such a great team previously. The fact that he does not name the new team in his memoir, nor any of the horses that came afterwards, indicated the limited relationship he had with them in comparison to Split Ear and Tuppence. Tuppence and the man who had him before Johnston did not bond in the same way. That also reflects the importance of individual personalities in determining the relationships that would form between man and horse. Another fascinating way that the relationship between soldiers and horses was strengthened was evident in the way that soldiers often anthropomorphized their horses and mules. For the soldiers of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces, anthropomorphizing their horses was a way to connect with their charge's individual personality and to describe that to other soldiers. For example, Frederick George Scott wrote, "I always knew what Dandy thought and what he would do," which would not have been possible without Scott humanizing Dandy's actions and behavior. Seeley, too, frequently explained what he thought Laurier was thinking throughout his book. That tendency to anthropomorphize equines also appeared in letters and trench newspapers. John McCrae assigned human qualities to his horse Bonfire in letters he wrote home from the Western Front. In a letter written to Helen Nelson, McCrae called Bonfire a gentleman in every fiber of his being. In other letters, McCrae wrote sentences such as, "My good friend Bonfire is well and sends his greetings," which further anthropomorphized Bonfire in his correspondence and showed the close relationship he had with his horse. In the images on this slide, you can see a photograph from the Guelph Museum's collection, on the back of which McCrae has signed a horseshoe as Bonfire's mark. One fascinating phenomenon connected to the anthropomorphic ways in which Canadian soldiers wrote about and formed relationships with their equines was their description of horses and mules as shell-shocked. Veterinary officers like Tamblin noticed the way that the noise and destruction of shell barrages made many of the horses nervous and, by extension, lose physical condition. Tamblin recounted a story told to him about how a sergeant major's horse, who got badly shell-shocked from the detonation, went completely mad. The animal rushed about and kicked several men and became so dangerous that it was ordered to be shot. The veterinary officer who witnessed the incident expressed an opinion that the animal's condition was no doubt due to the terrific detonation. The nervous effect of shelling and bombing on horses and mules was without a doubt very evident. In his memoir, Johnston also repeatedly discussed shell-shocked horses. He explained that in 1917, for example, the new horses and mules coming into their lines were in poor condition, as many were shell-shocked and blind. Johnston was assigned to a shell-shocked horse in 1918. He explained that the saddle horse was completely blind, and I never saw a horse so badly shell-shocked. While riding along, if a shell fell within 100 yards, he would jump right sideways, and being blind, he could not see where he was going. Sometimes it would be into a trench, shell hole, or whatever happened to be there. It was pitiful to see him tremble under shell fire. He must have had a hard go of it when he was wounded before. It made it really hard for me, as I had to be on watch all of the time I was with them, which was most of the time. In descriptions like those of shell-shocked horses, soldiers typically express their sympathy for the affected creatures. Additionally, certain individual horses could raise the spirits of groups of soldiers beyond the individual responsible for their care. The most prominent example of this is Seeley's horse Laurier. Seeley repeatedly emphasized how the soldiers loved his bay charger. Much of Laurier's fame did come from the fact that he was the commander's horse. But nevertheless, according to Seeley, the Canadian soldiers loved Laurier. Seeley explained, "I never could have earned the love and affection which was granted to me but for Laurier. Thousands of Canadians now living will confirm this fact. This handsome, gay, bay, thoroughbred was my passport wherever I went." As time went on, especially in France where we soon returned, the men got to love him more and more. As I rode along, whether it were in rest billets, in reserve, approaching the line, or in the midst of battle, men would say, Not "Here comes the general," but "Here's old Warrior." Seeley emphasized that idea again later in his book when he wrote of a Christmas while stationed along the Somme. He showcased the way that the average Canadian soldiers regarded his horse when he wrote, "I have said that Warrior had an extraordinary gift of exciting friendship and admiration of men. I shall never forget the cheers of the Canadians when I rode round the different regiments and batteries at Christmas time. They all shouted 'Warrior,' ran round to him, asked if he was all right, crowded him, officers and men alike." Thus, Warrior not only had a positive effect on Seeley's morale, as noted previously, but he also improved the morale for many of the soldiers with which he interacted. The images in these slides were from a Canadian Corps horse show in 1916. You can see the best team of mules, as well as a horseback wrestling competition from that show in Belgium. I have not found sustained writings from soldiers about horse shows, but I wanted to include these images here because there are so many in the collection of Library and Archives Canada, and a horse show is a common group activity that would have promoted morale. One of the most obvious ways in which the depth of the soldier-horse relationship was exhibited was through soldiers' writings about parting with their equine partners. Soldiers' grief at the loss of their horses was a highly visible example of interspecies comradeship. For example, a poem entitled "To Maud, an Artillery Pack Mule," written by Gunner G.T. Donovan of the Canadian Field Artillery and published in a Listening Post trench newspaper, highlighted the grief he felt at the loss of his equine partner. His poem is here on the screen, and I won't read it all out because it is fairly long. But through this poem, Donovan articulated his love for Maud, as well as his anguish at her death and his survival without her. The poem is particularly interesting for the way that through his final stanza, Donovan alluded to Maud's ghost still being with him. The final stanza implied that even though Maud died, her shade, as it marches along the front lines, still accompanies the author and brings him some comfort. Captain Stanley Harrison, in a poem entitled November 11th, evoked a similar image. In the epigraph to that poem about his horse, Harrison wrote about the animal's death. Then, in the poem itself, Harrison urged readers to remember the war horses and wrote of the ones that died in the war. "For the love by which guides my pen, I know great horses live again." Similar to Donovan's lines about Maud's ghost, then, Harrison's notion that great horses would live again has a consolatory tone that speaks both to the strength of his relationship with his horse, as well as to the comfort which that bond could still offer, even after the animal's death. Similar to Donovan and Harrison, the strength of Frederick George Scott's relationship with his horse Dandy was showcased when he discussed their parting. He wrote the following in his memoir, which was also reprinted in Tamblin's book. "I loved you dearly, Dandy, and I wish I could pull your soft face towards mine once again, and talk of the times when you took me down Hill 63 and along Hyde Park Corner. Had I not been wounded and sent back to England at the end of the war, I would have brought you home with me to show my family. A friend that not merely uncomplainingly, but cheerfully, with prancing feet and arching neck and well-groomed skin, bore me safely through the dangers and darkness, on crowded roads and untracked fields." Scott elaborated that after he was wounded, Dandy was kept for him at headquarters until, in order to avoid his being sold with the other horses to Belgians, our kind ADVS ordered him to be shot. "He was one of the best friends I had in the war, and I am glad he entered the horse's heaven as a soldier, without the humiliation of a purgatory in some civilian drudgery." The sentimental and heartfelt words that Scott wrote about Dandy's death highlighted the strength of their relationship. In the case of Dandy, who had been euthanized after Scott was injured, rather than enduring some unknown fate in Belgium, Scott drew solace that Dandy too had died a soldier. In the images on this slide, you can see bonfire at John McCrae's funeral. He plays a symbolic role here, with McCrae's boots turned backwards in their stirrups. This symbolism would have been consolatory for the participants in McCrae's funeral. The image also provides an example of what happened when a well-known horse outlived its even more prominent rider. Not all parting of soldiers and horses required the death of one party. When the armistice was signed, there were 1,692 equines with the Canadian Expeditionary Forces in England, and another 24,134 on the Western Front, for a total of nearly 26,000 horses and mules. Senior officers were given the option to purchase their charger and repatriate them to Canada. Sir Arthur Currie, for example, brought Patty, Lady Nicholas, Brock, and Teddy home from the war. Only 110 of those senior officers' chargers were repatriated to Canada. The nearly 1,700 horses with the Canadian Expeditionary Forces in England were efficiently sold on the public market there as soon as possible. That left all of the horses and mules in Belgium and France to be cast from army service. Tamblyn himself was the major negotiator for the Canadian government to work out a deal with the government of Belgium to take their remaining war horses. It was agreed that the Belgian government would take all of the Canadian horses on the Western Front at the cost of about £40 each. Junior officers and soldiers were not given the opportunity to purchase their mounts and ship them back to Canada. Captain R.G. Vickers of the No. 2 Canadian Mobile Veterinary Section wrote that the whole 2nd Division believed that not allowing soldiers to purchase their war horses was the dirtiest deal of the war, to use his words. The attachment then of many soldiers to their war horses was strong enough that a number were willing to purchase and send their equine partners to Canada at the end of the First World War at their own cost. In conclusion, I have argued that the soldier-horse relationship functioned as a mutual survival mechanism for both the human and equine participants in the Canadian Expeditionary Forces in the First World War. Furthermore, that bond between horses and mules and the soldiers responsible for them boosted the soldiers' morale during the war. First, this presentation focused on the practical ways that the soldier-horse relationship functioned as a mutual survival mechanism for both human and equine participants. As a result of the general outcry at the high equine wastage rates in the Boer War, practical changes were made to improve equine health and longevity leading into the First World War. While the terrible environment of the Western Front challenged the creation of relationships between soldiers and horses, in the partnerships that survived, it strengthened that bond through shared hardship and increased time spent caring for the horse. In addition, the daily care routines that pragmatically extended the military careers of equines also contributed to the formation of that bond. Grooming helped horses to build trust in the soldier and also served to boost soldiers' morales as it distracted them from the conditions of the war. That bond became so strong that in some cases it worked as a mutual survival device when soldiers saved the lives of their horses, or the equines saved the lives of the soldiers that worked with them. Furthermore, naming practices and the anthropomorphic language utilized by soldiers to describe their horses deepen their relationships. Of particular interest was the way that the Canadian soldiers humanized their war equines through their description of horses and mules as shell-shocked. The strength of that connection, which was most obvious when soldiers described losing their horses or mules, highlighted the emotional and morale benefits of that relationship. In his book, D.S. Tamblyn explained, "The question of who won the war has oftentimes been asked. To my mind, there is only one reply: man and his co-partners, the horse and mule. For without the horse, the war would have been lost." Much of the significance of the soldier-horse relationship is echoed in Tamplin's words. Without strong relationships that promoted the survival of horses in particular, transport and communication channels would have been severely weakened, which would have impaired the actions of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces. The soldier-horse relationship then, and the ways that it functioned as a mutual survival device, played a useful role in that conflict. Furthermore, an appreciation of the role of the soldier-horse relationship and the work of war horses more broadly is significant, as it provides a counterbalance to that dominant idea of the First World War as a break with tradition that emphasized new technologies. As a result, we can reach a more nuanced understanding of a conflict that was uniquely balanced between tradition and modernity, as well as fought in a period that marked a turning point in the ways that horses and humans interacted in both military and civilian spheres. Thank you so much.